Look closely at the person in your life who absorbs everyone else's chaos. The one who listens when everyone else is shouting. The one who offers a calm, steady hand when the world goes sideways. In the lexicon of modern psychology, we call them an empath. In the world of behavioral mechanics, they are something entirely different. They are a human seismograph. They don't just observe baseline behavior. They feel the microscopic shifts in atmospheric pressure before a storm even hits. Because of this, people mistake their tolerance for weakness. They assume that because an empath absorbs pressure, they have no breaking point. That is a catastrophic miscalculation. Every human system has a failure threshold, but when you push a highly empathetic person past theirs, you aren't just dealing with anger, you are triggering a precise, calculated systemic shutdown. In profiling, we look at the architecture of compliance, how people adapt to stress to keep the peace. An empath will bend, absorb, and recalibrate 1,000 times to preserve a relationship. But when that structural integrity finally snaps, the reversal is absolute. The warmth doesn't just fade, it vanishes entirely, replaced by a terrifying surgical detachment. They will look right through you with the cold, unblinking clarity of an operator who has completely mapped your psychological architecture. Every vulnerability you shared, every manipulation you attempted, every hidden motive you thought you masked, they see it all with objective, razor-sharp precision. And the most brutal part? They won't weaponize it to hurt you. They don't need to. They will simply lock the door from the inside, remove you from their narrative, and leave you to drown in the vacuum of your own toxicity. You will be left staring at a mirror of your own making, forced to face the reality of what you destroyed, with absolutely no way back. If you have ever wondered what happens when the most patient person in the room decides they are completely done, you need to understand the hidden mechanics of the empath's breaking point. Because once that line is crossed, there is no negotiation. There is no closure. There is only the brutal, quiet aftermath of a bridge burned so cleanly it leaves no ash behind. Stay with me, because we are about to dissect the exact behavioral sequence of what happens when you push an empath too far, and why the consequences are entirely irreversible. Look around this room. Look at the person sitting next to you. If you analyze their posture, their micro-expressions, the subtle cadence of their breathing, you can tell exactly how much stress they are carrying. Most people are walking pressure cookers, leaking their anxiety through nervous tics and vocal shifts. But there is a specific profile, a rare, highly calibrated subset of the population that handles stress differently. They don't leak it, they absorb it. We call them empaths, but let's strip away the mystical terminology and look at the raw human metrics. These individuals possess a hyper-advanced neural network for tracking human baseline behavior. They read the room before they enter it. They feel your hidden hostility, your deep-seated insecurity, and your quiet desperation before you even open your mouth. And because they feel it, they accommodate it. They manage your comfort at the expense of their own. This is exactly why predatory personalities, the narcissists, the exploiters, the behavioral predators, are drawn to them like moths to a flame. They see this profound capacity for patience and mistake it for a green light for exploitation. They think, here is a well that will never run dry. Here is a person I can break, piece by piece, and they will just keep gluing themselves back together. If that is your strategy, you are playing a game with variables you do not comprehend. You are sitting on an active fault line, convinced the ground will never shake. Today we are going to strip back the curtain on the psychological mechanics of the empath's breaking point. I am going to show you the exact behavioral loops that occur when a highly empathetic person is pushed past human tolerance. And by the end of this presentation, you will understand exactly why breaking an empath is the most dangerous, self-destructive mistake a manipulator can ever make. If you want to understand how genuine psychological power operates when the gloves come off, you cannot afford to look away from what comes next. To understand the brutal nature of the consequence, we first have to map the baseline. How does an empath operate in a relationship? They operate through a high-threshold architecture of compliance. They see your flaws, they detect your lies, they map your manipulations. Yes, they see them, but they choose to filter them through a lens of radical grace. They give you the benefit of the doubt because they can feel the unhealed trauma driving your bad behavior. This creates a dangerous illusion for the manipulator. The manipulator thinks, "I lied, and they stayed. I shifted the goalposts, and they adapted. I withheld affection, and they tried harder. I am completely in control." But you are misreading the data. That isn't submission. That is a conscious investment. The empath is actively burning their own psychological fuel to keep the bridge between you intact. They are paying the tax for your emotional bankruptcy. But nobody's reservoir is infinite. Every single time you exploit that grace, you are chipping away at the structural integrity of that bridge. You think you are winning a game of dominance, but in reality, you are just running out of time. Every system has a critical failure point. In material science, it's called stress-strain hysteresis, the point where a material is deformed so badly it can never return to its original shape. In human behavioral analysis, it is the moment the empath's emotional processing system completely overloads and shuts down to protect the core. When a normal person snaps, they explode. They yell, they throw things, they text you a paragraph of venom at 3 a.m. That is loud, that is emotional, and most importantly, that is exploitative. A manipulator knows exactly what to do with an emotional outburst. They can gaslight it, they can turn it around and make themselves the victim. But when an empath breaks, the room goes dead silent. The neurological shift is instantaneous. The emotional processing centers, the empathy loops that kept them tethered to your feelings, go completely dark. The survival brain takes over, and it turns them from an emotional seismograph into a cold, clinical operator. If you have ever witnessed this shift, it is deeply unsettling. The eyes change, the pupils dilate, the voice drops an octave, and the frantic, pleasing energy completely evaporates. They stop arguing. They stop explaining themselves. They stop defending their position. Why? Because they no longer care about your perspective. You have become an irrelevance. This is where the consequences become brutal. The manipulator, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, will usually double down on their standard tactics. They will use guilt, anger, or reverse victimhood. But it completely bounces off. It's like trying to hack a computer that isn't connected to the internet. Instead, the broken empath looks at you with absolute, terrifying clarity. Because they spent months, perhaps years, deeply studying your psychological architecture to keep you happy, they know every single one of your structural flaws. They know your deepest shame. They know your childhood metrics. They know exactly what drives your narcissistic supply. And for the first time, they don't protect you from it. They don't have to scream or call you names. They will simply state the unvarnished clinical truth of who you are in a single, calm sentence. They will hold up a mirror so pristine, so utterly devoid of emotional bias, that it will strip away every illusion you have built to survive your own reflection. They will tell you exactly what you are, how you failed, and why you are empty, not with malice, but with the cold indifference of a coroner reading an autopsy report. The final phase of breaking an empath is what behavioral profilers call the absolute deletion. Once the mirror is held up, the empath enacts a permanent quarantine. Most toxic relationships exist in a loop of breakups and makeup, the classic trauma bond. The manipulator leaves, the target begs them to come back, or the manipulator hoovers them back into the dynamic. This is because there is still emotional friction generating heat. But when an empath walks away after a systematic break, there is no heat. There is only absolute zero. They do not just block your number, they erase the psychological real estate you occupied in their mind. If you pass them on the street, they will look right through you as if you are a stranger. Because to them, the person they loved never existed. It was just a phantom they tried to save. You can apologize, you can cry, You can stage a massive crisis to get their attention, but you will find absolutely nothing but a brick wall. You see, the brutal consequence of breaking an empath isn't that they will ruin your life. It's that they will leave you entirely alone with yourself. They will withdraw the light, the warmth, and the emotional life support they were feeding into your fragile ego, leaving you to starve in the cold vacuum of your own design. You wanted to see how far you could push them. You pushed them off the map. And now you are completely lost in the dark. To fully appreciate the gravity of pushing an empathetic individual to their absolute threshold, we must first dissect the foundational mechanics of how they interface with the world. In the discipline of behavioral profiling, we do not view an empath through a lens of spiritual sentimentality. We evaluate them as an incredibly advanced, highly calibrated piece of organic radar. They operate on a hyper-vigilant behavioral wavelength that is continuously scanning, capturing, and cataloging microscopic data points from their environment. While the average person navigates a crowded room processing only the overt signals, the words spoken aloud, the direct eye contact, the loudest voice, the empath is silently conducting a continuous, deep-layer assessment of everyone within their perimeter. They are mapping human baselines in real time. They register the exact millisecond a person's micro-expressions deviate from their spoken word. They capture the subtle, involuntary tightening of a jawline, the almost imperceptible drop in vocal tone, the frantic pacing of a hidden nervous tic, and the faint scent of stress-induced cortisol. This is what we call the seismographic baseline. They don't just notice these anomalies. Their neural architecture is hardwired to absorb them, translating external atmospheric pressure into internal somatic data. They feel the shifts in the room before the room itself even registers the change. This profound sensitivity creates a highly specialized psychological map of the people around them. An empath quickly decodes your unvarnished emotional reality, identifying your deep-seated insecurities, your hidden hostility, your unspoken grief, and your masked motives long before you have consciously chosen to reveal them. Yet the most critical element of this baseline is not merely their capacity for advanced detection, but their deliberate behavioral response to it. Because the empath experiences the discomfort of others as an immediate internal echo, their default operational program is to automatically neutralize the fiction. They use their vast store of behavioral data to accommodate the predator, soothe the anxious, and validate the insecure, often acting as an invisible shock absorber for the emotional turbulence of everyone in their orbit. They adjust their own posture, modulate their own vocal cadence, and actively suppress their own boundaries to preserve the equilibrium of the environment. To the untrained eye, or to the opportunistic predator, this immediate, seamless adaptation looks like natural compliance. It looks like submissiveness, weakness, or a total lack of situational awareness. The manipulator looks at the empath's gentleness and concludes that their own deception is working flawlessly, completely unaware that the empath has already mapped their psychological architecture down to its bedrock. The empath knows exactly when they are being lied to. They are simply choosing to invest their own psychological capital into holding space for the manipulator's unhealed pathology. They operate under a prolonged state of radical tolerance, quietly absorbing the toxic spillover of the relationship while keeping a meticulous, subconscious ledger of every transgression, every microscopic boundary violation, and every calculated manipulation. This seismographic tracking runs constantly in the background, consuming immense amounts of internal bandwidth, functioning silently until the sheer volume of unreciprocated data pushes the entire system toward its critical structural limit. The architecture of absorption defines how the empath's high compliance thresholds and profound tolerance are systematically identified, targeted, and exploited by predatory or narcissistic personalities. In behavioral mechanics, we recognize that a relationship between an empath and a manipulator is never an accidental alignment. It is a highly predictable, systemic transaction. The manipulator, lacking an internal source of emotional regulation, operates as a psychological parasite, constantly seeking an external reservoir to drain. When they encounter an empath, they recognize a specialized psychological infrastructure designed to process, filter, and contain emotional waste. This begins a calculated process of gradual boundary erosion, where the manipulator actively tests the structural integrity of the empath's tolerance. They start with microscopic infractions, minor passive-aggressive comments, subtle shifts in emotional availability, or gaslighting over trivial matters. Because the empath's default operating system is tuned to radical accommodation, they absorb these initial shocks, rationalizing the predator's toxic behavior as a symptom of hidden pain or unhealed trauma. This response provides the manipulator with an immense payoff, known in clinical terms as narcissistic supply. The manipulator realizes that they can displace their own internal shame, chaotic aggression, and deep insecurity onto the empath, who will willingly metabolize it to keep the peace. This creates a deeply toxic architecture where the empath becomes a human shock absorber for the predator's emotional volatility. The manipulator deliberately constructs behavioral loops designed to trigger the empath's hyper-receptive nature, alternating between intense warmth and sudden cold withdrawal. This fluctuating atmospheric pressure forces the empath into an overdrive state of hypervigilance, burning massive amounts of their own internal psychological fuel to recalibrate the relationship back to a stable baseline. The manipulator looks at this frantic, self-sacrificing effort and misinterprets the data entirely. They view the empath's willingness to suffer as absolute compliance. They believe they have successfully installed a permanent system of domination, assuming that because the empath possesses an extraordinary capacity to hold space for cruelty, that capacity must be infinite. What the manipulator fails to realize is that this entire dynamic is structurally unsustainable. The empath is not submitting out of weakness. They are consciously subsidizing the manipulator's emotional bankruptcy using their own finite psychological capital. Every single time the manipulator shifts the goalposts, projects their own flaws, or weaponizes guilt, the empath absorbs the impact, but the internal structural damage accumulates. The empath's psychic architecture begins to warp under the sheer, unyielding weight of the toxic intake, holding the line through sheer force of will, while the manipulator, blinded by their own ego, continues to pile on more weight, completely oblivious to the fact that they are rapidly pushing the most resilient system they will ever encounter toward its absolute, catastrophic breaking point. The critical failure point, colloquially recognized as the snap, represents the exact psychological and neurological inflection point where an empath transitions from a state of total emotional absorption to absolute clinical detachment. In the framework of behavioral mechanics, this is not an emotional meltdown. It is a systemic emergency shutdown. For months or even years, the empath's psychological architecture has been under intense stress-strain hysteresis, absorbing a continuous influx of toxic data, manipulation, and boundary violations. They have bent, warped, and recalibrated their internal baseline to accommodate the manipulator, burning through their own psychic capital to keep the connection alive. But every system in nature possesses a precise threshold where structural integrity can no longer be maintained. When the manipulator delivers that final, definitive infraction, the one push too many, the empath's internal limits are crossed, and the entire processing matrix permanently fractures. Instantly, a profound neurological reorganization occurs. The brain's empathy loops, which previously forced the empath to feel and mirror the manipulator's emotional states, go completely dark to protect the core self from total annihilation. The emotional processing centers yield entirely to the cold, analytical survival brain, shifting the empath's profile from a hyper-receptive seismograph to a detached, hyper-rational operator. To the manipulator, who has grown accustomed to a loud, emotional, or easily guilt-tripped target, this abrupt transition is deeply unsettling. When a standard personality profile reaches a breaking point, they explode with chaotic aggression. They scream, weep, or launch into frantic accusations. A manipulator understands how to weaponize that emotional chaos, easily converting it into fuel for further gaslighting and reverse victimhood. But when an empath reaches the critical failure point, the entire room drops to absolute zero. The frantic, pleasing, and hypervigilant energy evaporates into a terrifying, unyielding stillness. The empath stops arguing, stops crying, and stops attempting to explain their perspective. They look at the manipulator with cold, unblinking clarity, completely devoid of anger or malice. This silence is not a tactical silent treatment designed to manipulate a response. It is the quiet of a tomb. The empath has completely ceased to care. The bridge has not just collapsed, it has been entirely deleted from their internal reality. The manipulator's words, tears, or sudden displays of rage simply bounce off the empath's newly formed clinical barrier, achieving no more psychological penetration than static on a dead radio channel. The empath views the person standing before them not as a partner, a loved one, or even an adversary, but as a completely mapped, highly predictable behavioral specimen whose capacity to cause harm has been permanently neutralized through the total withdrawal of the empath's emotional investment. The surgical mirror is the precise behavioral mechanic that makes the consequences of breaking an empath so devastatingly brutal for the manipulator. In normal relationship breakdowns, an aggrieved partner will often lash out, using insults, vitriol, or vindictive behavior to inflict pain. For a behavioral predator or a narcissist, this is comfortable territory. They can easily spin an emotional attack to validate their own victim narrative. But when an empath has crossed the critical failure point, they do not retaliate with malice or aggression. They don't have to. Instead, because they spent months or years observing, decoding, and mapping the manipulator's baseline behaviors to keep the peace, they possess a flawless psychological blueprint of the predator's inner workings. They know the exact origin of the manipulator's profound insecurity, the childhood metrics that drive their need for control, the hidden shame they try so desperately to mask, and the precise lies they tell themselves just to look in the mirror every morning. In this cold, detached state, the empath simply reflects this unvarnished architecture back to them. They deliver the absolute truth with the clinical, unblinking precision of a surgeon making an initial incision. They do not raise their voice, and they do not use emotionally charged language. They speak in a calm, flat, matter-of-fact monotone, laying out the exact mechanics of the manipulator's pathology. They state precisely what the manipulator is doing, why they are doing it, how pathetic the illusion is, and how entirely hollow their existence truly is. It is a psychological autopsy performed in real time while the patient is still awake. Because this data is delivered completely free of emotional bias or anger, the manipulator has absolutely no hook to latch onto. They cannot call it crazy, they cannot call it hysterical, and they cannot turn it into an argument, because it is delivered as a series of indisputable objective facts. This surgical mirror strips away every single defense mechanism, every layer of denial, and every grand ego illusion the manipulator has spent a lifetime constructing to survive their own reflection. For a brief, terrifying moment, the manipulator is forced to stand completely naked before their own internal rot, looking at the exact monster they are, exposed by the one person whose validation they relied upon to feel human. The empath takes the very data the manipulator provided through months of covert abuse and uses it not as a weapon to wound, but as an inescapable spotlight. The sheer psychological weight of this sudden, absolute exposure leaves the manipulator utterly paralyzed, stripped of their power, and forced to swallow the toxic reality of their own nature without a single drop of empathy to dilute the bitter taste. The permanent quarantine represents the final, irreversible phase of breaking an empath, functioning as a complete and systematic deletion of the toxic individual from the empath's reality. In the study of behavioral dynamics, most relationship endings resemble an ongoing negotiation or a chaotic, looping cycle. The standard toxic relationship thrives on a traumatic bond where boundaries are fluid. There are explosive breakups followed inevitably by desperate makeups, fueled by emotional friction and unresolved psychological gravity. Manipulators rely entirely on this friction to maintain access, utilizing a tactic known as hoovering to pull their target back into the behavioral loop through guilt, manufactured crises, or sudden displays of vulnerability. They assume that the door will always remain slightly ajar, because it has in the past. But when an empath enacts the permanent quarantine after crossing their critical failure point, the entire energetic grid goes completely dark. This is the behavioral manifestation of absolute zero. The empath does not merely block a phone number or unfollow a profile out of anger. They execute a surgical extraction of the manipulator's presence from their psychological real estate. They don't leave room for closure, they don't demand explanations, and they completely stop acknowledging the manipulator's existence. If the manipulator attempts to engineer a crossing of paths, or if they happen to lock eyes in a public setting, the experience is chilling. The empath looks directly through them with the vacant, unblinking indifference one reserves for an empty chair or a blank wall. There is no lingering resentment, no hidden spark of anger, and no subtle micro-expressions of pain for the manipulator to exploit. To the empath, the person they once loved has effectively ceased to exist. That individual has been reclassified from a partner into a completely neutralized environmental hazard that has been permanently sealed away. This total withdrawal of emotional life support is the most agonizing consequence for a behavioral predator. The manipulator is suddenly denied the very thing they require to survive, a reaction. Without the empath's high-quality emotional fuel to feed upon, and without any psychological leverage to manipulate a response, the predator is left entirely alone in a vacuum of their own design. They can launch massive smear campaigns, send essay-length apologies, or orchestrate elaborate emergencies to elicit a sign of life, but their efforts achieve absolutely nothing. Every toxic arrow they shoot simply drops into a bottomless, unresponsive void. The empath has installed an impenetrable clinical barrier that cannot be negotiated with, bargained with, or breached. By forcing the empath past their breaking point, the manipulator effectively pushed them completely off the emotional map, and in doing so,